Mr. Wallace shoved me into the back seat of my own car, his hand covering the crown of my head, gripping it so tightly that he pulled out hair as he pushed me back and activated the child lock before slamming the door. Mr. Burnage got in the back seat with me, held me down with more force than someone his age should have, and put me in the seatbelt. He did this while Mr. Wallace knelt down and picked up the keys I'd dropped after tackling me. Mrs. Burnage got into the passenger seat. She turned back towards me, looked me up and down, and smiled, depravity practically dripping from her wrinkled eyes. She turned her head from me to her husband and asked, "He's not normally my type, but do you think when you're done I can keep him? He turned into such a handsome young man." Mr. Burnage laughed as he turned towards me. His hot breath covered my face and smelled of a putrid marriage between garbage and rotten fish. He addressed his wife while still staring at me. "Don't be selfish. You and I both know that he's older than your usual. You'd tire of him. Plus, he's gone and made himself a little internet sensation now, hasn't he?" He cocked his eyebrows knowingly at me as he continued. "Turned himself into quite the commodity. I'm sure we could get a good price for him if we auction him off between some of the regulars. Cheryl has already expressed some interest. God knows we could use the money." I didn't know what they were talking about, but I knew I had to get away. Mr. Wallace had entered the driver's seat, and he'd started backing out of the driveway. I didn't know how this was going to work, but I had to try. I swung my legs off to my side, leaned back into the seat, and used all the force I could muster to kick Mr. Wallace right in the face. I overestimated the length of my legs and ended up kicking the air instead of Mr. Wallace's face. Mr. Burnage howled with laughter. "Feisty, eh? We can't have that." He grabbed my legs from the air, pulled out a scalpel and a syringe. He cut a vertical strip in my jeans on the inside of my leg, and expertly, despite my flailing legs, slicing into only the fabric and never the skin. He found the femoral artery and jabbed me with the needle and pushed the liquid in. I woke up groggy, my eyelids too heavy to open, and I heard voices behind me. It took a second for them to come into focus. "Go back to work. The guys will be wondering where I am. I was supposed to be down at the station an hour ago. If y'all need anything, just let me know, okay?" "We will," I heard Mr. Burnage respond. "I think we're pretty well set here, but we couldn't have done it without your help. Thanks again." I heard a door open and then shut as I strained to open my eyes. I was lying down on what felt like one of those chairs you sit in at the dentist's office. My hands were bound together behind a chair with what felt like duct tape, my legs tied to something on either side of the chair, forcing them to be spread apart, and my head was propped up a little bit. Because I was mostly lying down, the first thing I saw was the ceiling. Fluorescent lights with thin metal grating for fixtures flickered above me. My gaze drifted down from the ceiling to the wall about 5 feet in front of me, where there was a large television mounted on the wall. There was nothing on it. Below the television was an array of scalpels, clamps, and syringes, along with other medical equipment. Some of the equipment I didn't recognize or understand, a whole bowl full of silver egg-shaped objects and an assortment of electrical cords. There were numerous labeled jars, the labels handwritten on them with marker on duct tape. Desiccant, tanning agent, preservative. It was then that it had dawned on me where I was. I was in Mr. Burnage's taxidermy office. Before I could look around anymore, Mr. Burnage approached me from my left, and Mrs. Burnage came up and helped me from my right. Mr. Burnage extended his hand above me, and Mrs. Burnage's hand reached out to meet his. They held hands and smiled at one another, resting their entwined fingers on my stomach. They looked down at me, and Mr. Burnage began to speak. At first I was upset when I heard from one of our previous clients that you had written about us on the internet. Really, seriously furious. But your story spread around between some of our regular clients. And they have quite the bidding war going on between them ever since. I hope after they see the work we've done, they'll be inclined to spend even more. I suspect that you will be our retirement. And I guess you've forced us to retire anyway now that so many people know about us. Well, no matter. It's time. He zipped open his jacket pocket and pulled out a bottle. I couldn't see the label because his hand was covering it. But when he poured out 3 of the blue, diamond-shaped pills, there was no mistaking what they were. I'd seen the commercials. Despite all the control I was trying to maintain over myself, I screamed, I couldn't imagine why they would have me take those, and Mrs. Burnage put her hand over my mouth, stifling my screams as her other hand grabbed a water pick from the side of the chair. Mr. Burnage grabbed the top of my shaking, struggling head. He asked Mrs. Burnage, "Honey, could you please grab the nose for me?" Mrs. Burnage pinched my nose shut with her free hand, and Mr. Burnage held the rest of my head immobile with his right hand. He held the pills with his left hand, and with it, he pulled my jaw down, opening my mouth, and dropped the pills down my throat. Immediately, Mrs. Burnage turned on the water pick and began to jet the water into the back of my throat, making me gag as it hit. I was determined not to swallow. Mr. Burnage applied force at the top of my head and at the bottom, forcing my teeth to clench over the water pick, and as Mr. Burnage kept the stream going, I couldn't spit anything out. I couldn't breathe out of my nose, and my mouth was full of water. I just wanted to drown. I tried to commit suicide and breathe in the water as opposed to dying by however they were planning on doing it. But my body didn't cooperate. I swallowed the water, each of the pills trickling down my throat and into my stomach, weighing on my stomach as if they were 100 pounds each. Mrs. Burnage stopped the water pick, and I gasped for air. Mr. Burnage's hands released my head, and he laughed as he advised me. "Don't worry when you have an erection that lasts more than 4 hours. You don't need to call a doctor, nor will you be able to. Honey, would you please?" Mrs. Burnage walked over to the television, grabbed the remote control that was sitting next to the bowl of silver eggs, and she fumbled with it for a second before finding the power button and turning it on. The Samsung logo popped on the screen as she looked back down and scrutinized the remote again before finding the play button. She pushed it. On the television screen was one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. Long black hair, flawless olive skin, sultry eyes, and moreover, completely naked. She was sitting up on a floor with her legs spread apart. Her naked pussy opened to me. She looked at the camera, rubbed her nipples, and gingerly touched her pubic mound, asking, "Wanna watch me play with myself? I'm so wet for you. Look how wet I already am." She moaned as she inserted 2 fingers into herself. I looked away. I was disgusted by what they were trying to do. I could never become aroused in this state. I don't know what they were trying to do. I couldn't understand what they wanted. Mrs. Burnage walked over to me and grabbed the button of my jeans and undid it. She pulled down the zipper tab, moved her hands to either side of my waist, and yanked my pants down, taking my boxers with them. My flaccid penis was now exposed, and she held it limply in her hand. She brought her face down to it, puckered her old, dry lips, and lightly kissed the head before turning to me while licking her lips wet. She said, "Close your eyes all you want, dear. Just give it time." I sat there for a solid 30 minutes, my mind racing on what they were going to do to me. I was drenched in sweat, never having been so terrified in my whole life. I heard orgasmic moaning, and I looked back at the screen. I had deliberately avoided it because I knew they wouldn't continue unless I got hard. I didn't know why they wanted it, but I knew that I didn't want them to continue. The woman on the screen was now with another woman, even more beautiful than she. They were climaxing together as one of them was licking the other and fingering herself at the same time. Despite myself, I felt my penis start to rise. Mrs. Burnage squealed with excitement. "Dear, look, he liked that. He can't help himself. He's been trying so hard, but he can't help but become hard." She cackled as she remained transfixed on my growing cock. I willed it down like I've never done before in my life. But I couldn't. Despite everything that was going on, my dick had come to complete attention. I felt all the blood that was being used by my penis rush to my head, sweat trickling down my forehead out of fear. Mrs. Burnage walked over to me and grasped my penis firmly in her hand and smiled. She used the electric controls on the chair to prop me up a bit more, and I saw Mr. Burnage walk over to the table and grab a scalpel, a tube, and an electric cord. Mrs. Burnage lifted my t-shirt up to my chest and said, "Oh good, honey. We have an innie this time. I hate when we have outies." As Mr. Burnage walked over, my mind finally started working properly, and I remembered my broken watch. I moved my hands and then realized that I could reach the face of my watch with my index finger and thumb of my right hand. I began to pick at the shards of glass, hearing tiny little pieces clinking as they hit the floor. The sound so minute that the Burnages wouldn't have noticed. I only heard it because I was listening for it. Mr. Burnage drew near and placed his hand on my stomach and examined my belly button. "This will do very nicely. Nice deep hole. Should be able to hide the cord nicely. Dear, could you please take a photo before I begin for our buyers? Mrs. Burnage took out her Polaroid camera and stood at my feet. She asked me to say cheese and laughed as the flash filled the room. The picture came out of the camera with an electric buzz. She grabbed it and waved it around in the air. As she was doing that, she grabbed a large leather scrapbook off the table, flipped through the first half of it until arriving at a blank page about 3/4 of the way through. She looked down at the now developed photo of my mostly naked body, and she smiled as she grabbed a glue stick and applied it to the back of the Polaroid. She stuck the picture on the page with a satisfied thump. Mr. Burnage took out his scalpel and brought the cool metal up to my stomach, and slid it around in smaller and smaller concentric circles until it arrived at my belly button. He pulled on it, testing it, and pressed the tip of the blade into the lowest part of my navel. He turned to face me and grinned. "This is gonna hurt." As the blade punctured my stomach wall, blood beginning to come out. I screamed like I'd never screamed before. The pain was unbearable. Somehow, through all that pain, I still remembered my watch. I had flaked off enough of the left side of the watch and was now able to grip the glass and pulled it out of the watch face. I gripped it between my thumb, index, and middle fingers, cutting my fingers as I shifted the glass to get a better grip. I'd never been so happy to cut myself. I began sawing away at the duct tape that bound me as Mr. Burnage proceeded to insert a metallic, flexible tube into the incision he had made in my belly button. The pain was unbelievable and nearly caused me to black out, but I concentrated all my energy onto holding the glass. As he began to push the metal tube further and further into me, I sliced the last segment of duct tape. I broke my right hand away from the tape, pulling out most of my arm hair on my wrist, and swung it around the chair. I used the glass for my watch and aimed it at Mr. Burnage's eye. Before he even knew what was happening, he had glass protruding from his eye. Eye juice and blood began to pour out as he stepped back and screamed. I knew I had little time before they could react, so I reached down to the floor, my legs still bound, and picked up the scalpel that Mr. Burnage had allowed to topple to the ground. I adeptly used it to slice the cords that bound my feet and finally broke free. Mrs. Burnage was right in front of me, still by the table. Her old lady reflexes and strength were not quick enough to escape my anger and disgust. I grabbed her by her curly hair and slammed her head into the metal table, repeatedly, blood everywhere. Her scream stopped and she dropped to the ground. I grabbed the scalpel again and turned to see Mr. Burnage charging towards me. Fortunate for me, now he had only one eye, and I think his depth perception was off. I evaded him as he leapt towards my throat and took the scalpel to his neck and slit his artery. He held his neck with one hand, grasped onto the table with the other, pulled himself up, and reached for the medical equipment. I know I should have just finished him there, but I just wanted out. I grabbed my jeans off the floor and grabbed the scrapbook where Mrs. Burnage had placed my Polaroid. I ran to the back of the room and saw my car keys and cell phone lying on a small table. I ran out the door, into my car, and drove as fast and far away as I could from there. My mind raced faster than my car as I continued down the freeway. I knew I needed to stop soon because of my wound. But instead, I just took off my shirt and bound it against my waist as tightly as I could to prevent and soak up any bleeding. I kept driving well through the night. Once I was sure that I was far enough away, I stopped at a store and bought a shirt and a first aid kit. They looked at me strangely and worriedly at the register, but I think they were too scared to tell me no shoes, no shirt, no service. I checked out with cash, pulled the tags off the shirt and put it on. I checked into a hotel a few towns down the freeway and nursed my wounds. It wasn't until I was finally safe in the hotel room that I finally was able to view the scrapbook into which Mrs. Burnage had placed my photo. I opened it up and flipped to the first page. It was a pricing sheet for taxidermy services. At first, it seemed normal enough. Listings like whitetail game head $385, elk game head $750, boar $465, etc. Then my throat closed shut as it started getting fucked up. Human child, by age. I'm not even going to list the prices from now on, just the products. He had different prices for children, different prices for adults. But then under the human category, and even under some of the larger animals, I began to notice asterisks. I followed the asterisks to the bottom of the page. The asterisk text said, "Pleasure surcharge, prices may vary." I was a bit slow on the uptake and started to flip through the book. My ears began to ring, my mouth went dry, my stomach dropped, and my heart raced around my ribcage. Page after page of photos and recipients. Photos of naked men and women, always with their legs slightly apart. The penises were always erect. Some pages had a before photo, where the person was still alive but naked. It then had an after photo of the preserved corpse. I flipped through until I gasped even harder as I saw one entry in particular that caught my eye. I recognized the corpse. It was Mrs. Wallace. I'll tell you what was on the receipt, but I am not telling you the prices. The receipt read, Melanie Wallace, 48-year-old female. Adult preservation, X amount of dollars. Pleasure surcharges, vaginal insert, vaginal vibrators, anal insert, anal vibrators, oral insert, oral vibrators, breast enhancement. Total charge, X amount of dollars. Paid with Visa. Signed, Alex Wallace. Tears streamed down my face as I finally fully realized the service that Mr. Burnage offered. My mind raced as I tried to figure out the words to describe it, until I finally thought of it. Did I ever mention Mr. Burnage? He was a necrophilial taxidermist. Thanks to a suggestion from user Saturday Lunch, I've taken the scrapbook to the FBI. I don't even know the number of crimes and atrocities it contains. I don't care to keep looking. I have given my statement to them, and because of the number of people who have been devoted clients of Mr. Burnage, they've decided to place my parents and I into witness protection. This may be my last post. I will not be able to comment or respond to your PMs. I'm sure I will look at your comments at some point when I'm sure I'm completely safe. Until then, thank you all for your support and your kindnesses. Oh, and to those of you who have been clients of Mr. Burnage, fuck you.